these sessions. All right, so it's 5 o'clock, last session of the day for everybody who's joining us for the Combine. It's been a great day, lots of really good sessions today, some great Twitch stream from Super League, League of Legends. Again, Indiana Sports Corps has done an amazing job helping us get this going. I want to welcome you to this panel on esports and disadvantaged youth. I have two Jameses that are with me on this session. I'm going to be both the moderator and a little bit of a session participant. Before we start, how about if Jim, you start and tell us a little bit about your background, and then James, you follow.
Yeah, so today I'm going as Jim, and that's going to help us out with conversation, we hope. Jim O'Hagan, Director of Digital and Virtual Learning for the Racine Unified School District. I also oversee libraries for the school district. I also oversee our esports program, which is on its fourth year now, I believe. I've been hosting the Academy of Esports podcast now for over 2 years now, which is focused in on issues related to esports and education and kind of making the argument for that. I'm also a notorious troublemaker. I love poking Riot a lot lately, it seems, about community guidelines and standards and how they're kind of, cutting out some of us in the field. But we're having conversation, and that's a good thing, right? I'm not a gamer. Well, I am a gamer, but I'm not when you would call competitive. But I love this culture. I love promoting it. I love seeing the beautiful things that kids are experiencing through this on all levels, ages. And working on my PhD in the field of instructional technology and design at Northern Illinois University, and focusing in on self-determination theory, which is related to intrinsic and extrinsic motivations related to esports. So there's a lot going on there. Sorry.
No, that's awesome, Jim. And James?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is James Roussel. I'm the Esports Program Coordinator over at the Emerald Foundation in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where we help push esports programming to disadvantaged youth all across the state. I'm sort of in charge of our micro-level operations here. A bit of my background is in social work primarily, where I work in restorative justice and case management with young adults and teenagers. And I'm trying my best to transfer those skills over to the esports realm, because I think it's a really great opportunity to engage kids in that capacity. In regard to esports itself, I hesitate to call myself a competitive Street Fighter player anymore, because I don't win very often. But I do have a lot of fun with it, and I've been a tournament organizer for the fighting game community for a long time as well. Very much in the same boat as Jim. I think what's really great about esports in this capacity is trying to be as inclusive as possible to get as many people engaged in the opportunities that are aligned with esports that they might not be getting from traditional sports or performing arts. So very much excited to have that conversation today.
That's great. Thanks, James. Emerald Foundation does a really interesting work. And Jim and James, I'm actually glad to have you two meeting each other too, because
I am as well.
Yeah. I think you're going to find these two organizations to be very interesting to be able to learn from each other. I'm Derek Pugh. I'm the chairman and CEO of Arena Data, our product Geoscore that most people here know about, and obviously hosting this with the Indiana Sports Corps. I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this particular session, which started quite a while ago in a conversation between the founder of Emerald Foundation, which is where James works, and myself. We were talking about how in American society, we've really focused on sport, while there's other things we focus on as well, but traditional sport as one of the ways that young people learn certain skills outside the classroom, primarily leadership, teamwork, sacrifice, and those sorts of things, that the advent of esport created a whole new opportunity. And if you look at in US history, if you look in recent US history, of the past 12 presidents we've had of the United States, 6 of them were college athletes, which shows how much emphasis we put on these extracurricular learning activities, and we're really focused on traditional sport. And I feel like at some point in the not too distant future, our first president that learned all of their leadership and sacrifice skills as an esport player. And when that's true, you want to try and be as inclusive as you possibly can. And you need to look at how do you make this fair for all kids in school to be able to use esport as that tool for leadership building and other soft skill development. And there's certain issues that are related to that, and how do you cross those barriers? Because obviously traditional sports has become a way out for a lot of disadvantaged youth, and there's no reason why esports should open that door much, much wider. So I'm going to start with a little sort of background comments and then a question for both of you. I learned this when I used to work in Philadelphia. I worked for the Wireless Philadelphia Foundation that was intended to create digital inclusion in Philadelphia because we have such a high poverty rate in the city and a number of students that were in our public school system that did not have access to the internet and certainly had disadvantages to the students who did in terms of homework from home and everything else. So the FCC has come out and they've estimated that about 21 million people in the United States don't have internet connectivity at all. That's not an absurdly high number, but to me a little bit of a shockingly high number considering there's about 300 million people in the United States. 40% of schools don't have broadband access. That I actually do find shocking.
What did you say? What was that number?
40% of schools in the United States don't actually have broadband access, which I find shocking because of the E-rate programs the federal government put out. But still a number that's relevant and important for us to think about. And 35% of lower income households with children in school don't have internet connectivity at home sufficient for them to be sport participants or really to participate in the kind of homework that their peers are doing at more advantaged school districts. So I guess my first thought question out to both of you is esports requires not only equipment that costs some money, but it also includes access to broadband in order to allow remote play in a meaningful way, particularly for some of the more competitive games that will get you into college. How do we attain an esport culture for disadvantaged youth in light of the fact that we have these two hurdles we've got to get over? Jim, why don't I just start with you? You maybe talk a little bit about your experience in Wisconsin.
Well, I'm not sure about that 40% broadband number. I just did as much of a quick search as I possibly could in the 2 seconds that I had. And it might be, I think that number may relate more to students in rural areas once they leave school, their access or lack of access to broadband, which to me may make a heck of a lot more sense. I worked in a rural area where for a lot of our kids, the only thing that they had access to was satellite or driving up to the school on a weekend. So I absolutely get that. But speaking on a larger scale, first of all, I think we really need to stop in a lot of ways calling it what it's not. The phrase is a lot of people like using because 20 years ago it worked was digital divide, which there was this a divide could have been based on your geographic location, which is still true in a lot of ways. Don't get me wrong, but we kind of lump it all together. At my house, I can get fiber, but across the street, my neighbor cannot. Even though we may be very socioeconomically similar, that would be a divide. What we're truly talking about here, and what we need to start really calling it, and we've seen it now, especially in our Racine Unified School District, where we do have a high level of poverty with our kids, is digital poverty. We need to start calling it that. That is the more appropriate term, I think, in a lot of ways. It isn't just about access. It's being able to afford the access. It's being able to afford the device. When COVID first hit, for some of our kids, the first thing that gets shut off, and it happens very easily, is cell phone service. That gets shut off before electricity and water and anything else. And usually there's protections in place about those things. There is not protection for internet service. There is not protection for cell phone service. So we need to start looking at these things more as utilities, because they are things that are required now for day-to-day life. Just as school, we require compulsory service, compulsory attendance, for our students up till they're 16 years old to go to school. Our internet service should also be treated as kind of the same way, protected, and because it is so important. One of the steps that we've taken, because the FCC did rewrite some of their E-rate guidelines, is our school district now has partnered with Spectrum to start providing internet service directly into the home at the cost of the school district, which is a good start. But as our esports season is starting to ramp up and we are still remote, we have a number of students who don't have access to licenses or the PCs that they need to compete. But working with our community partners, I think we are working through solutions with our public library, with our companies that are in town who have equipment that has been sitting fallow for some time. And they're like, well, nobody's coming into the office. Can you use this? Absolutely, we can use that. So trying to find that esports isn't just about the computers and the games that we're playing. It really comes down to something that can be prideful for the community. And I think it is because when we start to attract so many kids who might be on this, on some, disenfranchised in a lot of ways. We're talking about kids today who are at whatever disadvantage it may be. Well, we'll call it disenfranchised. when we start bringing those kids together, those are the children of parents who struggle with, how does my kid do anything? You know, they don't want to do sports. They don't want to do band. They don't socialize, but they love playing video games. Those parents start to see those things, and now you're building a community around it. And so it doesn't happen overnight, obviously, but these are the things that I think can start to move the needle with all of this.
Yeah, I love that. The concept of it taking the entire community, I think, is a really great point, which I think was what I pulled out of that the most. And James, I know Emerald is focused a lot on school districts in around Lancaster and even towards Harrisburg. And there's, in Pennsylvania, clearly a very difficult school district in terms of its economic wealth compared to other school districts. But how have you guys been dealing with the fact of low levels of connectivity at the home, and also how do you handle the computer issues?
You know, sort of piggybacking off Jim a little bit, to add to the data conversation, I'll say it's a little bit of creativity and a lot of collaboration between local organizations. If I sort of use Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I reside, as its own little petri dish, we have a number of high school districts that couldn't afford appropriate computer equipment or networking pre-COVID, and now we're working in a post-COVID environment. So what we've been doing recently is identifying community-based organizations that serve the same kids that these school districts serve, and sort of organizing them as hotspots for places for kids to be able to collaborate and play together in a safe capacity. One of the groups we've been working with is Boys and Girls Club, who's a widespread, national organization that has a lot of different pockets and areas across Pennsylvania who we've been working with to provide equitable resources at. To say that, the equipment provided is top of the line and totally ready for competitive play would be disingenuous, right? There are, for example, a major esport, Counter-Strike, has recently moved completely online, and no matter what high-level equipment you have at home, it's not going to be the same competitive experience because they're not playing a local area network. So what we try to identify is, one, I can be as creative as I want and go into an underserved school district's computer lab and bust open their computers and see what I can scrounge around just so they can meet the minimum spec requirements for league. Or I can see how we can work together as a community to pool our resources and identify what areas need to be addressed to get kids playing in an equitable capacity. And I'm really proud of my region for what we have been able to do thus far, and hopefully we'll continue into the future. There's a really large financial barrier to esports compared to other traditional sports. And I think, it'd be disingenuous to say otherwise, but we need to find ways to be able to work together to provide the same opportunities across the board.
I want to tell you that both your communities are really lucky to have you two because of those great answers, because it takes somebody to start pulling, all these interested groups together in order to solve problems like this, because they're not easily solved. So I want to commend both of you. Like, your communities should know how lucky they are to have you.
If I may add something to this too, because I think this is pertinent to the whole conversation of how things have also started to evolve in COVID. Before COVID, AAA titles were something that we were very interested in, right? It seems that, the Overwatches, the League of Legends, the Rocket Leagues, the Smash Brothers, those things that we play, have now, because of COVID, opened our eyes to other opportunities. Does it look like professional esports? No. Some of our game titles, some of our kids are meeting together, self-organizing and playing Among Us at lunch. Is that an esports title? No, it's a game. But again, this comes back to community. Are we meeting a lot of the same program goals that we were looking to do before? Absolutely. Are we meeting all of them? No. But what we are able to do is still bring kids together from all across our community together to hopefully start to not only just redefine what athletic culture is anymore, but I'm also now looking at our program as ways to redefine esports culture. If we're not a pipeline to the pros, none of our goals is ever pipeline to the pros at this K-12 scholastic level. If it was, our programs would be very different, but they're not. So if our program is not about a pipeline to the pros, why would we care if our program is modeled off of a pro game or a pro experience? It doesn't have to be. Do we want it to be? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd love to play every game, but at this point, the reality is we want to make sure that there's a lot of other things that we're caring for: physical health, mental health, diversifying opportunities for student participation, and simply promoting the idea that play is important and finding all those opportunities for our kids to play. Because the two ways you push against the mental health crisis, and believe me, COVID, not just a health crisis on the physical sense, but on a mental health sense, the two ways you push against the mental health crisis, one is positive adult interaction and two is through play. Those are the two easiest ways to do it. And we need to make sure that we are addressing those things before we care about the Overwatch license or we care about Riot's guidelines, those kinds of things.
Yeah, great point, Jim. And I want to say that it sort of leads us into the second question. Something that I learned from James's boss, or if you want to call him boss or founder, Joe, was something that I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about, which is the issue of truancy in schools, which I think is also an issue in its own sort of way during COVID. And the use of esport as a way to offset truancy. I think when you're not in a disadvantaged school system, you assume kids are going to school and you think that maybe there's just something not quite as good about the teaching in disadvantaged schools as there is in other schools, which frankly is not a valid necessarily at all. May have some validity, I don't know. But the truancy issue is a significant one. And, James, I know from your guys' perspective in Lancaster, pre-COVID, and I'd be curious to hear how you keep kids engaged in school, maybe during COVID too, which is a little more difficult. Tell us about some of your experiences of integrating esport programs into disadvantaged school systems for the purpose of getting rid of truancy or resolving truancy issues.
Sure. I think sort of defining truancy and the core causes of it are pretty important first. If we look at a community-based organization or a school district trying to bring on esports as a form to encourage their students to attend, I don't think that mindset works terribly well. If the goal is to provide such a great source of entertainment that your students want to come to school and sit from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., then it's not going to work. I've worked with plenty of young adults who, as much as I would try to convince them to attend high school on a daily basis, it doesn't work out because there's much better forms of entertainment to them that are available outside of school where they don't have to sit all day. So what do they get out of it? I think what esports brings to the table is, one, community inclusion with a school district that they might feel isolated from, and two, opportunities present to them that might not be available in other capacities. So, for example, how do we engage students who might attend school but aren't playing on a sport or don't participate in performing arts in any capacity, but they're really into Dungeons and Dragons, for example, right? Then we find students who have the same interest, and I think it's up to the school to take it on as a responsibility to include them in some capacity. And I think that's one of the main ways to battle truancy with the students that we do work with. It's not a matter of how can we make school enticing? It's more so how can we make school more welcoming? How can we make it something that you want to attend even though it is difficult, because at the end of the day you're going to get something out of it. That's a good bit more important than hanging out with your buddies during hours where you could be attending. Jim, I would love to hear your perspective on it as an educator. I've worked more so with individual students and, treating problems like this, but I would love to hear like a macro level perspective.
Well, in my role as an educator, I see things as I'm the director of digital virtual learning. So I oversee not just I work across the district with our traditional schools, but I also work with overseeing our virtual program, completely virtual. I lovingly, and it's hard, and it sounds bad when I say it, but I have to preface this. I lovingly call my virtual program the land of misfit toys. It is a program where kids come where the traditional school model wasn't working. That's 7 to 3. I couldn't do 7 to. I hate getting up early. Don't ask me to get. But for some kids, they still do that. The key to all this is all my conversations for our virtual program start with. And it's very disarming sometimes to see this, especially if a parent is there, to ask a child, what is your favorite video game that you like to play? Because, they're coming in thinking this is going to be a conversation about school stuff. Again, this isn't about school stuff. What James is leading to, this is about engagement. This is about, do you care what I am interested in? Do you really care about who I am as a person? That's where a lot of people miss when they say, we're going to reinvent education. We're going to reinvent, everything. And they say, we're going to bring in the best educators. We're going to bring in the best curriculum. We're going to bring in the best whatever. And really all that stuff, you know, schools, public schools have usually, hopefully, the best curriculum. And they do have people who care. And they do have sometimes good facilities, but not always the best. But where people always seem to miss on, I had this conversation yesterday with a gentleman, it is not about the building so much as the invitation to learning. And with esports, it's the same thing. What is the invitation to esports? One of the biggest problems I see with esports right now at the K-12 scholastic level is that it is still very gender neutral, whereas it skews mostly to males, and it is still largely white or Asian. And I have to ask people, well, what is your invitation to those people in your school, those kids in your school? Are you just putting up a flyer that says come and hang out? Or are you aggressively walking up to a table of girls and saying, hey, you should be part of esports? You know, the conversations, a person like James who's a social worker, that's a great place to start. Invite the social worker to learn what esports is, because the social worker is going to have the thumb on those kids, hopefully, or at least know of who are those kids who are hardest to reach, the ones who are the least engaged, and getting them partnered with those people in program who hopefully are going to then be the ones who then maybe flip the switch. And it can't be about, you know, Rockford. When I was at Rockford Public Schools, one thing I admired about our athletic program, before we started esports, but our athletic director said, I'm doing away with grade point requirements. And that was very controversial. In fact, ESPN Outside the Lines came in and did two stories, one when they announced it and one several years later to look at the data. And by eliminating those grade point requirements and saying to kids, it's more important that you're here, and it's more important that you're around a positive adult interaction, and it's more important that you're playing, what they found was, yes, kids would not make grades, but it wouldn't kick them off the team. And by keeping those kids engaged, GPAs went up, attendance went up, and overall the student athlete attendance graduation rates increased. Those are huge gains. And those are again, everybody is so worried about everything else, titles, things like that. Those are all, to me, very secondary. The first part is the invitation, the engagement, and making sure. My goal for my program is I want it to be a cross section of my student population, racially, gender, socioeconomically. It's not there yet, but I'll tell you what, when I take my kids to state competitions around Wisconsin, it's a heck of a lot better than what I'm seeing. And so these conversations need to happen early. And I'm not talking about after you've launched your program. I mean, before you start, your first question you should ask is, what are going to be our strategic goals that we're going to try to make? And what do we want our teams to look like out the gate? What should we be looking like now? Not after you're all set up. By then your culture is set, and sometimes it's too late.
I love those answers, because the idea of engagement and understanding who the student is and making them feel connected to the school, because you're not just trying to force a square peg in a round hole, or whatever you want to call it. Talk a little bit about, once you have that engagement, how do you incorporate that into the curriculum program for that student? Because you've now basically told the student, I get who you are and I get what you like to do. By knowing that, you're going to know, or you should have some sense about what they also want to study, to me. And so how do you integrate what you just did with eSport to get those kids interested in coming to school and being at school with what you're doing with more traditional style education? James, why don't you start, since Jim just finished?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not an educator, nor am I qualified to speak from a curriculum perspective. So rather,
You're doing pretty good, though. I'll say that. So feel free. You're not going to insult me.
But I think Jim's perspective on curriculum would be more valuable. And two, in order to still answer it, I think I'll take it from a more community organization and inclusion standpoint. Something we do with our students, well, actually, I'll go back to how esports ties into it all first. One, it does in every single capacity. It's not just, it's such a lame sentence. It's not just gaming. I swear there's more to it. But it encompasses audio engineering, sound engineering. Video games are one of the few art forms that incorporates every single facet of technology advancement that you can think of. And if we think of technology advancement in terms of the job market, there's going to be a heck of a lot more jobs involved there than there are currently. When I see a student that is interested in graphic design, then there's easy tools to line them up with, such as Blender or Unreal Engine, that are entirely free, and there are community members that I can link them to as well. Something that happens really common in grassroots level, like Discord servers, for example, really small level communities that take place entirely online, is their tournaments and events are all run by different individuals from all walks of life that encompass one, promotion, marketing, social media, as well as tournament organizing and getting folks on board to play the same game in the first place. A lot of education in regard to esports happens outside of the classroom because a lot of it is still very much grassroots. It's not, a lot of it is not taking place in the big LCS tournaments that you see every single day. It's the 20-man Super Smash Brothers locals that your students go to week to week at the local college. And the great part about those is those students who are actually really interested probably do have a direct hand in it. There are a lot of state level TOs that are below the age of 18 that participate greatly within their local communities. And so I think that's a really cool way to incorporate esports. And it sort of naturally leads to education outside of the classroom and in regard to career exploration. I don't have the same perspective from a classroom, but that's sort of what I see of our kids and how we communicate with our community-based organizations.
Yeah, that was a great answer, James. And Jim, I'd like you to continue a little bit on curriculum, and then of course we have a question, so we'll take a breath after you answer the first, and we'll talk about this question.
So I'm going to drop into the chat here, and I want to, if I can, if I may, I would like to put a picture up on screen for everybody to see if that's okay.
Sure. We lost your audio, Jim.
Because I muted myself by accident. All right, so hopefully you all can see that photo, and I've tweeted the link out to that photo. Nico, who's in France, NASEF a couple of years ago did a really good job of kind of laying out a broad general picture of the ecosystem, if you will, around esports. And Nico went through and actually listed out the careers. And as you can see there, I think there's 113 or 116 careers that he could sort through with just esports at the center of that ecosystem. Okay, and that is an amazingly broad spectrum. What I am looking for, and curricularly it's not happened yet. My podcast is called The Academy of Esports, but I would love to have that be an actual physical space. My school district is actually an academy school district, much like the Nashville Public School District is. Rockford's Public School District is also where we have schools within schools, right? Focused in on certain areas. I feel that the Hogwarts of esports is sitting out there somewhere. You know, Hogwarts is kind of a, you know, to people who I hope everybody here has read or watched the Harry Potter movies to some degree. But, you know, the idea of being a wizard and going to school to learn how to be a wizard on the surface sounds like, well, you go to learn to wave a wand and that's all there is to it. But as you see how the movie progresses, just as an educator, this is just the educator of me watching it and saying like, well, how do they run their school? Because this is really fascinating. And it is. But seeing it from that perspective of, oh, there's defense against the dark arts, there's botany classes, there's their own sports, there's all those things taking place around being a wizard. And what I've found recently, Angelique Giannis put out a tweet just the other day, which was beautiful, was, again, it wasn't esports specific, but it was around games and gaming culture, which also has a lot of naysayers also in education. It's not following traditional models, so we have to work really hard with and message this appropriately, but using the game Among Us around persuasive speeches. Because again, the game Among Us, 10 people in a room, you have to persuade other people that either somebody did it or you didn't do it. You know, and she set up very clear rules and guidelines around how to do that and constructed the whole persuasive argument, you know, with her students in that room. It is thinking along the lines broadly, again, beyond the games. If you just focus on the games, if you just focus in on what you have right there, you miss out on a much bigger opportunity. So where are we including our kids curricularly? We're giving our kids roles like shoutcasting. We're giving our kids roles as social media managers, as moderators, as content creators, whether it's graphic design work. Our esports jerseys that you see behind me here on screen had student input in every single one of them. In fact, the one that's over this shoulder, the Rebels one, that one was completely, that and the Bulldog one, those were completely solo student projects. Okay. These are things that, again, don't necessarily show up on a GPA right now. They don't show up in on a transcript, but these are the things that do carry into other classes. For example, I have to salute right now the Minecraft Rube Goldberg competition that Steve Isaacs is leading with NASEF. And having a student of mine who's a 7th grader, virtual student, who was struggling with his transfer of energy science project, or just the lesson. And all of a sudden he turns in his pulley project from a couple of weeks ago for that Rube Goldberg thing. Not prompted, not said anything. But again, if I was a very traditional educator and said, oh, Minecraft, that has no place in this, I would have lost out on that opportunity for that student to self-advocate, which is huge in education. Most kids are very passive learners in school because they're told where to go, what time to be there, what subjects they're going to take. They have very little control over their educational environment. But what we've started to see now, especially as a lot of us are working remotely, with teachers in real time in online spaces or virtually, where there's a lot more asynchronous learning, kids are now becoming a little bit more proactive about how they work their education. I subscribe to a philosophy called universal design for learning, which is, a 5-page paper. If that's the point of the assignment, that's cool. But if a teacher wants you to be persuaded about something, it doesn't have to be a 5-page paper. What if they could do a video or draw a comic or talk through their understanding of the subject? We have to find these multiple means for kids to express themselves. And I feel that esports now is starting to help kids develop their voice. We talk about the soft skills all the time: communication, collaboration, working with kids in other spaces and places. Again, the Racine Unified School District is 5 high schools and an alternative high school, but it's 5 primary high schools. We have kids, we don't practice separately. We practice all together, all 5 high schools in one space, which I was told you cannot do that. We have gang problems. We have, rivalries and things. I loved at our state championships last year, the kids at the Walden School, which is the purple jersey, with the real school Bulldogs, getting together after one of their matches and scouting the other teams together, like sharing information. These are the things, again, they're not going to show up on your transcript right now, but they are going to show up in your graduation rates. And here's more importantly, they're going to show up in your community, because now we're impacting the community as a whole with our kids who are going to be the most influential going forward.
Jim, that's great. Let's get you to stop share.
That's sorry about that. Yep, there we go.
No, I just actually enjoy seeing your guys' faces. I like having to be able to see it. Thank you for resharing also to that last request. So Christopher has asked, any pointers for first-year esport coordinator coach in rural Alabama, minority-dominated high school? Jim, I'm going to let you start. James, I know you have this is not dissimilar from your experience in Lancaster, though Lancaster's not completely rural, but certainly more rural Pennsylvania. So Jim, do you want to take that one on first, and then James can follow?
Esports programs, again, do not have to be modeled off of pros. If your program is about developing a pipeline to pros, then you're going to have a completely different experience than most. We've said, my friend Marcus Howard and I were kind of chatting over LinkedIn today about, a bubble, esports bubble. And professionally, there's a lot of people who are worried about that at the pro ranks, because there's been a lot of dollars that have rushed into that space right now. And people are going to be wanting their returns in the next couple of years. And as those returns aren't happening, people are going to be pulling their dollars out. Our program, though, when I look at our program, again, our program is designed around what are our strategic goals in our school, not just for esports, but let's start with our strategic goals for our student body. Where do we want our school to go, and how does esports fit into everyone? And what I encourage people to do is always start with a 1-page document that just says, here's our strategic goal. And then in a grid, write out, here's how esports fits into this strategic goal. If esports isn't fitting into all your school or your district strategic goals, you're probably not digging deep enough to figure out where the connection is. You need to do a little bit more education. It doesn't have to be you competing against other schools either. As I talk about, if there's an esports bubble to burst tomorrow, we would be fine, because I have 5 high schools that are able to compete against each other. But let's say it was just one high school, right? Let's say we just had the one high school and we have a really poor internet connection. We're speaking into a rural area. What do you have around that can create an organized competitive experience? You can have, it could be grade level teams. It could be a draft. It could be you do things on a name basis. And find out what kids really like and love. And again, organized and competitive. It could be that you're having practices, but if you're in these rural areas and right now you're not set to have an esports experience, start with a club experience. Try some things out, rotate games through, give kids, again, multiple opportunities to participate. The kids who like NBA 2K may not like League of Legends and vice versa. But give kids a taste a little bit of everything as well too. Remember, it's all about an invitation, and ultimately in all this, it should be about building a better community and giving kids an opportunity to participate.
All great points. James, you want to add?
I would say in a really broad sense, the way I've seen esports clubs develop in the area is there's sort of one or two groups. One being groups of students who are really competitive, and that's their main focus. They want to play within AAA games, they want to succeed, and they want to beat their opponent. Two would be esports clubs. Esports as a space for students to collaborate together, work together, and just have fun and hang out after school. So I think the main conversation really starts with your students first rather than anybody else. If you want to make an esports club and you've identified a population that wants to participate within it, what exactly do they want to get out of it? Esports is a heck of a lot more than just sitting down, queuing up against another team that's in your bracket for HSCL, play versus NASIF, whatever, playing your match and then going home at the end of the day. It's a really great place for you to foster a community for your students that they might not be able to foster otherwise. And one, I think it's really cool that, you yourself are starting it rather than, having a student come to you for input saying like, hey, I'd really, this is something that's really cool to me. I would like your assistance with it. I think it's really great to see somebody who's taking the initiative to start it and then introducing their students later, because what that happens is you create a really powerful mentorship effect. One of my favorite examples is I've worked with Elizabethtown High School here in Pennsylvania, and the general manager for their club is someone who knew nothing about video games when we first started together. He just had a bunch of students come up to him and say, hey, I want to do this. And he's like, oh, okay, I'll try, just give me some pointers. But they found an adult figure that validated their interests, that shared their interests, and wanted to help them expand upon it. Fast forward a year later, I go to Elizabethtown College for a local League of Legends tournament that's happening between a couple different colleges here in Pennsylvania. And I see that general manager and some of his students. So I go over, sit down with them and say, hi, how you guys doing? And as soon as the game starts, the general manager starts asking his kids questions. Do you think that was a good play? Do you think they did the right picks and bans? What do you think about this team composition? And it made me so happy to know that there was some students within that particular high school that might have had an interest that they might have perceived as niche, but was being shared by someone who was a valued and respected member of their school, ergo their community that they go to every single day. So I think you're doing some really great steps. And I think the more you include your students in your planning process and also the implementation process, the more successful it's going to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to amplify one thing that James said, because it's something that's very true for how Arena manages or through Geo platform our play. It is very important to understand there's a distinction between the elite players and what I would call the more fun players. Mm-hmm. There are way more players that just enjoy playing video games than there are elite players, way more. And those two pieces, unlike really in other sports, if you went to a professional football player and asked them whether a Pop Warner player was playing football, they'd say absolutely. If you go to an elite esport player and ask them whether a club player is an esport athlete, they might say no. It's a very unusual contrast in this particular space between the truly elite players who've put tens of thousands of hours into playing and the players that are playing for fun. But they're both important segments for everything that we're talking about with disadvantaged youth. And I think points that were both well made by both Jim and James. I'd add one more thing to what Jim and James said, is that reaching out to local colleges that have esport programs in your community, that have kids that are playing on their teams and want to do community outreach, be coaches, be teachers, mentors, that can be very helpful. I know in some of the programs that Emerald did, some of the local universities, including Harrisburg U, offered scholarships into their programs so that they knew that, the kids knew that when they were playing, they were developing into the possibility of getting a college scholarship. Obviously, as Jim has said before, that's typically more around AAA titles because that's what's being played in those universities. But still, all those things I think can also be helpful. But some great points made by both Jim and James. I just wanted to amplify on a couple. We're getting
Just real quick too, I want to just qualify the term disadvantage, because yes, we are talking about in a lot of times socioeconomics, but we also need to realize too that more than half of my kids on one of my teams has an IEP. Those are typically a lot of our kids who have IEPs are also disconnected from the traditional fabric of schools in a lot of ways. I also have a number of kids with mental health issues. Okay. And a lot of kids feel disconnected because of that. So I just want to make sure that when I'm talking about the kids in my program as being disadvantaged, there's a spectrum and a breadth to that term that I just wanted to qualify really quickly. So thank you for that.
It's great questions. And we have a number of them coming in. I actually would rather be engaged with the questions and answers and follow through of our pieces. So Loki RG, I'm assuming that's how you want to be referred to, wrote a question that says, as a content creator whose viewership majority comes from minority-heavy New York cities, often found, like you stated, that the biggest problem are first, the cost to develop players, and second, parents not really, what he's saying is understanding what esport is all about. What can a creator like Loki or G do to help educate youth parents in these disadvantaged households about the benefits of esports? Yet another partner for you guys actually are the developers.
Well, and that's we have not. This is getting into something that's become very personal. It is personal just because I've seen how crushing it is for a developer to snatch a title away for some kids, especially kids who have passion for it, who love it, and are being told, sorry, you can't compete in the way that you want to anymore. I feel that over the years, companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft have done a fabulous job of engaging educators and kids free of charge, events, going to conferences, supporting local initiatives around their use. In fact, I remember when I was growing up, Apple was almost literally giving their computers away to schools. And now you go to some school districts and they're literally paying twice the cost they would for an Apple product versus a PC because of that relationship. It's respect. It comes down to a lot of respect, and it comes down to having a voice at the table. As a developer, I would be inviting in educators to take a look at my game and saying, what can we do with this? I mean, imagine right now, again, let's take Angelique Giannis's use of Among Us for how she's doing that with persuasive writing. I would hate for Among Us, I forget, something Sloth, I forgot the name of the developer, but imagine them coming and saying, cease and desist, you can't use our game this way. That would be shocking. That would be absurd. But that's what's happening right now. With Riot has taken away an educational tool that we are using with students to engage them in school. We are not, again, building pipeline to the pros, but they're doing it in the name of sustainability, which I can't figure out how you get sustainable by restricting access to a game title. But as somebody who is, again, looking at New York, in cities where there is high minority, having those conversations, it does have to start small. You know where I would start to partner if schools are not going to be the place where you want to partner because they've already got the kids there? Public libraries. Tristan Wheeler at Cleveland Public Library has set up an amazing esports program that runs out of there. My own public library here in the city of Racine said, how do we start to attract more teens into our space? And this is all before COVID, of course, but I said, how about you buy 10 gaming laptops and have them available, not for checkout, but if kids need to come in and play, you could set up tournaments, and again, introducing people to it. And it's not just introducing kids, let's introduce their parents and, more importantly, their grandparents. I couldn't tell you the excitement some of my scholar gamers showed when I even suggested the idea, recently, of how crazy would it be if you sat down with a bunch of 65-year-old retirees and taught them Overwatch? They want to show off their world. They want to show off what this is, and they want to share it with other people. And I think as a developer, as a content creator, if schools are not going to be, if teachers are not going to be responsive to your wish to engage students, and how do you get the word out? Start with, again, looking at public libraries and saying, let's start to engage here. Those are the spaces that are most public. That's the space that is the community hub for a lot of places, and especially in rural areas where library access may be limited. That puts a lot more, I guess you could say, emphasis on the importance of the space. And then when you go for a referendum, now you've got people who say, oh, this is a really forward-thinking space. This space is much more than the books and the internet service that they have there.
That was a great answer, Jim. And I want to echo that. I think, from being in Philadelphia and having actually served on the board of our library system, libraries are trying to figure out how to transform themselves. They tend to run a lot of good after school programs, particularly in the neighborhoods. It's a great idea, Jim. It's a good way, and they tend to be viewed as education sources for parents. So if you can commit, if you can get a library official to be committed to your cause, that's a really great way to find someone that can really drive, your title into a community, or the teaching about the values of esport. James, you want to add anything to what Jim just said?
I do. I think Jim brought up some really fantastic points. And something I would like to add to that as well is, something I've done from a lot of my time in Pennsylvania is attend a lot of different school board meetings. And those school board meetings tend to consist of 7 people who dislike my proposition, and maybe 3 or 4 people that are lukewarm, or maybe they like me a little bit. And what's really important is, one, for a conversation to happen, one, respect needs to be present from both parties. I'm not going to walk into a room and try to convince anybody of anything. The number one thing I want to get out of a conversation like that from someone who disagrees with me in regard to esports is why their perspective is that way. Not so much that I want them to change their mind, but I want to understand where they're coming from specifically. Typically what happens is there's a lot of misinformation in regard to esports. Violent video games breed violence, of which there's no correlating information. This is a complete waste of my time, and there's no applicable benefits to their education, which is also misinformation. But what's more important than pointing out misinformation and trying to dissuade them using your own narrative is to try to understand theirs. Why are they thinking this way? Is it perhaps because they're worried about how their students are spending their days after school, and they think esports might be a waste because they're really concerned about them getting into a higher education facility, for example? So when we start to have conversations like those, rather than saying, you have a ton of misinformation and it's not entirely correct here, let me show you my information that is correct. I think a better conversation to have is, here's my perspective, please tell me yours, and let's see where we can meet in the middle and hopefully both get something out of this.
The book Moral Combat. If you haven't read that book, read the book Moral Combat.
That is a great book.
I'll put a link to that in the chat.
Guys, great answer. Low-key RG, I hope that was helpful. Martin has asked a question. Do you think it's possible, and Martin, I assume you mean the national government when you put NA, would help build communities around esport for the disadvantaged youth? And if yes, how should they approach that? That's a tough question. About 17 days before an election cycle, but it's an interesting question.
It actually, it's not. I don't think it is, but let me explain. So when we started the Wisconsin High School Esports Association 3 years ago, it was bootstrapped by educators across the state of Wisconsin who are really interested and passionate about esports. I am somebody who, again, I'm on the library boards. I serve on a state level as well too for some of our things, and having those legislators at the table, we invited legislators to our first formation meeting. Esports is something right now that if you said to somebody, hey, you should really learn more about esports, in the past, the answer used to be, what the heck is that? Now the question is, ooh, can you tell me more about that? Because I think that people are seeing what's going on in the news, what's going on in the press. But what we have to remember, as much as we all love esports, there is more people who don't, or there's more people who are ignorant to it. We have to hit all areas when we're doing this. It's not just the low-hanging fruit people who know what esports is. We have to treat this as it is a fragile, a Fabergé egg. It has to be protected, and it's beautiful, and we know how beautiful it is. But when we show it to people, we have to present it in a way as if, you have to wear white gloves and you have to be very careful of it. But here's where the benefit has come from all this. Having these conversations early, engaging our Department of Public Instruction and inviting them to meetings too, some of their leadership, or giving them a phone call, because they're not the governor. The governor's got other things to worry about. But DPI, for example, state legislators, your local ones, they love the opportunity to come in and meet with kids. They love the opportunity to see, let's talk about video games. If they're a young legislator, chances are they're probably playing video games. But I am going to put into chat also, this is a link to a tweet the Academy of Esports put out. We co-wrote legislation for the state of Wisconsin to fund esports programs with seed grant money. That includes not just public schools, but private schools, parochial schools, and homeschool associations. Esports is so wonderful for kids, and we know what the demographics are of kids who are playing video games. It's across the board, socioeconomically and racially, 97% of boys and 83% of girls, according to Pew Research. Numbers like that don't lie. We don't have numbers like that almost anywhere when it comes to broad interests, okay? These are the times when we should be looking at legislation too, especially now as we come out of COVID. How are we going to restart engagement? Kids have been separated for a while. How are we going to restart the engagement to get them back together and teaching them how to socialize? There's going to be it's going to be hard for some kids to go back to school. Some kids have thrived in this environment. We have to find every opportunity that we can to provide environments where kids are going to, again, feel safe. They're going to feel like they can connect with others. And again, I think esports is going to do that. And legislation like what I put into the tweet here, it's not dramatic. It's not 700 pages of healthcare legislation. This is, hey, it's a grant program to be funded and managed by Department of Public Instruction for all students. Don't cut anybody out, but and $50,000 that can be used for anything that you need. Pay for a coach, buy equipment, upgrade your internet connection. Whatever it is that you need.
I just want to add on to that real quick. I think if we look at like an overarching system that would be, implemented by national government, I don't see that happening for a very, very long time, or really in a meaningful capacity. I think something important to highlight is, all sort of the small battles that go on, but how much of a big impact they have. We're really lucky that we have a really great relationship with our Secretary of Education, Pedro Rivera, here in Pennsylvania, who does support our mission and sees esports as something valuable. But Jim's analogy of holding this thing in white gloves and saying, I promise if you touch it, it's not going to bite you, is very, very accurate. So, a lot of community growth typically happens in macro level organizations from top down, but esports typically doesn't tend to happen that way because it's a lot of small communities that are in pockets around a specific geographic area, and then we sort of bring them together. And so I think a national overhanging structure might not be the most beneficial for it, but I see it being in the possibility within, the future, maybe in like 10, 25 years, but I don't know if that would be sort of the best thing for it currently. And I think we are winning some small battles with, within our own state governments, within our own local governments. And I think the narrative is slowly changing, but certainly not at a point where it can be considered on a national level.
Guys, that was great. We've come to the end of our actual time. And I think one of the important things to learn from this, other than the really great thoughts that both of you provided, is that we can all help each other. So you have email links for both James and Jim that are available on this particular session. These sessions are going to be around for a long time, so you should always be able to come back and take a look for them. I'm sure both of you would welcome people who are looking for help in what they were trying to do. But part of what we can all do in the esport world is this is a learning exercise, and understanding what we've done that's been successful in different pockets, I think is really helpful. So I want to just express gratitude to both James and Jim for being on this panel. You guys were great. I thought it was a really amazing conversation. I hope everybody who watched enjoyed it. And as I do at the end of each one of these, thank you to the Indiana Sports Corp for helping put this together, because this is a great source of information for a lot of people. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your Saturday night. Stick around. There's a lot of fast networking going on for kids looking for colleges and college scholarships for the next couple hours. There's also a really good Rocket League tournament that Super League is going to put on later if you want to see what some of the AAA games look like that are played in college and some of the better athletes are looking to get into college, how well they perform. Stick around, look at that at 7 o'clock too. But thank you both, Jim and James, and thank you for all those who participated. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.